Hey everybody, Mr. Fantini here, and welcome back to our reading of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So, last time in Chapter 5, we read through and survived the most awkward lunch date ever in the history of Western literature. Nick sets up this sort of serendipitous meeting between Gatsby and Daisy, whom by this point we've learned have a secret history together. We don't know all the details of it quite yet, but we know that they've met. They've had some kind of romantic involvement in the past, and Nick agrees to do this. He sets up this date, and when it finally rolls around, Gatsby goes through such crazy pains to make sure that it looks the way that he imagined. He fills Nick's house with flowers. He manicures his lawn. He does all this stuff, and almost chickens out at the very last second. He runs out into the rain and then comes back in totally all soaking wet. But despite this super, super awkward beginning where Gatsby almost can't bring himself to talk to Daisy, they kind of figure it out after spending some time together, and Gatsby takes Nick and Daisy on this extravagant tour of his mansion, showing off all of his luxuries and his library and his wardrobe and all this crazy stuff. So when we leave off with Chapter 5, Nick kind of leaves them to their own devices, leaves them alone together, and the implication is that an affair begins. We know that Daisy's unhappy in her marriage with Tom. Tom is having affairs all over the place, as we know, out there in the open. So I guess Daisy decides that she's going to try to reclaim her past romance with this fling with Gatsby. And with that in mind, we're going to jump right into Chapter 6 and read the first couple pages together to set you up to read the rest on your own, okay? So we're going to jump into Chapter 6. And as always, what Fitzgerald likes to do is start off his chapters with the very poetic, very lyrical, kind of flowing narration. This is where he kind of does a lot of his heavy lifting in terms of backstory and establishing context in these first couple pages. And these first couple pages of Chapter 6 are really, really important because we finally learn the real truth of Gatsby's past, of who he really is. Not the full, and we'll get more details as it goes on, but this is sort of the first real unvarnished glimpse into who Jake Gatsby really is. Okay, so we'll jump right in with Chapter 6. About this time, an ambitious young reporter from New York arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, any statement to give out? It transpired after a confused 5 minutes that the man had heard Gatsby's name around his office in a connection which he either wouldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and with laudable initiative he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety spread about by the hundreds who had accepted his hospitality and so become authorities upon his past, had increased all summer until he fell just short of being news. Contemporary legends such as the underground pipeline to Canada attached themselves to him, and there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat that looked like a house and was just moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. So we start off with this awkward conversation between Gatsby and a reporter who just kind of shows up on his door, at his door, knocks on the door, and says, "Hey, do you have anything to say?" And Gatsby's like, about what? And this shows us that Gatsby's sort of outlandish behavior and mysterious past has finally attracted some notoriety on Long Island. Not just social gossip, but the newspapers are like, what's the deal with this guy? Who no one really knows who he is, where he comes from, how he made his money, and yet now he owns this gigantic mansion and holds crazy parties every single weekend. That's a little bit strange. So this reporter shows up to ask him about it. And then at the very end, after running through some of the rumors about Gatsby, Nick, our narrator, drops this line about why these stories were a source of satisfaction for James Gatz of North Dakota. Let's see who James Gatz is. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had it changed at the age of 17, and at that specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants. But it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Tuolumne, and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I suppose he'd already had that name ready for a long time. Even then, His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. So we learned that Jay Gatsby isn't Jay Gatsby at all. That he's sort of this alter ego of a man named James Gatz. And, James Gatz, not quite as flashy of a name as Jay Gatsby, right? And we learned that James Gatz was not from a wealthy family in San Francisco. Rather, is the son of poor farmers in North Dakota. And that's where he sort of came up with this conception of the man that he wanted to be. A man of extravagant wealth, of extreme refinement, of great class. Yet, as a poor kid from North Dakota, he doesn't really know what refinement and class looks like. And so this man, this character, Jay Gatsby, that he becomes is more a reflection of what he thinks wealth and class looks like, rather than what wealth and class actually are. And yet, at the end of this whole reveal, this description, Nick says, well, you got to kind of respect the fact that he stayed true to that vision of his imagination all the way to the end. Let's go a little bit further. For over a year, he had been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half-fierce, half-lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins, because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. But his heart was in a constant turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand, and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies, until a drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. For a while these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. So we get a glimpse into who Jay Gatsby was before he was Jay Gatsby. And he leaves the family farm and he's kind of just walking along the shores of the Great Lakes looking for any work that will get him something to eat and a place to sleep. And he's kind of just drifting along. He's always been this sort of charismatic guy, and so he's always been good with girls. But while he is sort of just surviving in these little hovels and wherever the work kind of takes him, he's building this imagination. And what is the very first thing that we learned about Gatsby in the very opening pages of this novel was that he had a tremendous capacity for hope. And so in this sort of like hopeless place, living in poverty, he invents this new version of himself. And, all the credit to him, he creates that version of himself, as we know by the fact that, when the book begins, he's bought this fabulous mansion out on Long Island, right? He seems to have achieved some measure of success, though we're not entirely sure how just yet. Let's go a little bit further. An instinct toward his future glory had led him, some months before, to the small Lutheran college of St. Olaf in southern Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and to despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior, and he was still searching for something to do on the day that Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along the shore. Cody was 50 years old then, a product of the Nevada silver fields of the Yukon, of every rush for metal since '75. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft-mindedness, and suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, played Madame de Maintenon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht were common knowledge to the turgid journalism of 1902. He had been coasting along the all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gats's destiny in Little Girl Bay. So there's a lot going on in there, right? We're not going to dig in and do all the context for all these sort of like allusions to, turn of the century American history and things like that. Suffice to say that James Gats is walking along the shore one day and he sees a yacht, a big fancy boat anchored just off the shore, right? Probably the most fancy, most fabulously wealthy thing he's seen in his life to that point. And on board that is this sort of like aging, kind of eccentric millionaire. He made his money in the gold rush and the silver rush and the copper rush in the decades before, in the late 1800s. But now he was just kind of drifting along aimlessly on this boat. And Gats, or Gatsby, whatever you prefer, knows that he happens to be anchored in a really dangerous part of the lake. And so what's he do? To young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the railed deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody. He had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions. One of them elicited the brand new name and found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to Duluth and bought him a blue coat, 6 pairs of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the Tuolumne left for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby left too. So he rows out to this yacht. This young man lived in poverty his whole life, imagining a better destiny for himself, this shining future of wealth and extravagance, and he sees it. He glimpses this yacht. It pulls up right in front of him, right? I mean, what a ticket to destiny could you imagine? Of course he's going to row out and talk to the captain. And at this point, he's kind of known, he's realized his charms. He gives this guy a big smile. And when Dan Cody asks him his name, what does he say? Jay Gatsby. In that moment, he's kind of like reborn. James Gats is gone. And Gatsby's never going to acknowledge that old life ever again, really, except for to tell Nick about this backstory a little bit later. But the important thing is that at that moment, as he climbs up onto the deck of this yacht, he becomes kind of a new man. And that's sort of his ticket to realize this dream, this destiny that he's always kind of imagined for himself. Yeah, let's go a little bit further here. We'll do a couple more paragraphs here. He was employed in a vague personal capacity while he remained with Cody. He was in turn a steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer for Cody. Sober knew what the lavish things Dan Cody drunk might soon be about. And he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. It might have lasted indefinitely, except for the fact that Ella Kay came on board one night in Boston, and a week later, Dan Cody inhospitably died. So there's maybe some intrigue, some scandalous story in there about how this scandalous woman comes on board and takes his money, and he dies shortly thereafter. I mean, it's a little bit of a sexist, scandalous story, but we'll leave that for right now. I remember the portrait of him up in Gatsby's bedroom, a gray, florid man with a hard, empty face, the pioneer debauchee, who during one phase of American life brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. And so keep that in mind too, that this image of wealth is a fundamentally American one, right? It represents the pioneer wealth of this man who went out west and experienced the violence and the brothel and the saloon in order to create his image of wealth. And I think that violence is kind of under the surface in Gatsby as well, as we'll see. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes in the course of the gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. And it was from Cody that he inherited money, a legacy of $25,000. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him, but what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education, the vague contour of Jay Gatsby filled out to the substantiality of a man. So this is really where Jay Gatsby comes from. He is a no-name, nobody, and remember that name when that phrase when Gatsby and Nick were going for a drive. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. He starts off as just some nobody, at least by his own standards, right? But through this sort of serendipitous, happenstance, collision of destiny with this guy, Dan Cody, Gatsby gets a ticket to the connections, to the lifestyle, to the sort of like personal skills and the charisma that he needs to form the vision of himself that he has. And yet the interesting thing about this like self-actualization, is that it's precisely his success that makes him so strange to the people on Long Island, right? I mean, he's basically done the American dream. He's made a better version of himself, at least, or made the version of himself that he wants. Whether it's better or not is a matter for some debate. But the fact that he has made himself from nothing doesn't inspire admiration from the people on Long Island, but rather what? Suspicion and contempt. They think that he must be a spy, he must be a murderer, he must have some sort of dark and insidious past. And, we'll find out that he kind of does, but it's very interesting that he has accomplished his goal or his dream, or at least some version of it, right? Though, as we'll see, the world isn't always as accommodating to Gatsby's vision as he would hope. And we'll leave it at that, and I'll let you jump in to finish up chapter 6 and learn a little bit more about Gatsby's past and Gatsby's future, at least as he envisions it. All right, keep on reading. I hope you're enjoying the book, and I'll see you next time.